also represented the interest of the publishers, the relation with the Italian and the European institutions, but we also have quite a peculiarity, which is to having a research and development team specialized in technologies for the book sector within the association. That I think is quite unique. We do many things. This is a simplified map, but I will not go through all the things we do, but just to give you the idea that apart the more traditional activities in the various areas of the publishing, so textbooks, academic, trade, etc., we do all those things. So we do book promotion, a book fair, training, we manage standards, we do innovative project. We created a foundation to better serve the visually impaired people in accessing books, etc. We do all those things always in connection with the respective in European and international organization. That's one of the key principles for us, to develop things for our country, always thinking international. And all these asterisks show the cases where we are also in the board of those associations. As you see, we are very often in the governance body of the main organizations that in Europe and worldwide deal with the publishing industry. Aldous was one of the last born initiatives that we coordinated. Is a European book fair network. We have 20 book fairs in this moment, both international and national book fairs, all the most important. I'm glad to tell you that we would be delighted also to have the Kiev Book Fair with us as soon as possible. So that's was just a short introduction to say from where I come. But let's move to the Italian data. Italian data, we were happy to have in 2019 good data from the market. After a very long crisis that started in Italy in 2011, a bit later than in other countries, but it was very severe because between 11 to 14, the market decreased 20%, and very slowly we went back to the levels of 2011. Unfortunately, we were just arrived back to the previous situation when the COVID crisis exploded. And so we have to restart again, but we are optimists always for the future. In this period of the change, we experimented this very interesting data that the e-commerce in our sector was relatively small in 2011, was just 9%. Last year reached 27%, and I will show you what happens with the crisis in a moment. A characteristic also of the change this year is from 2011 is the number of Italian titles that are sold abroad for translations, which doubled during this period. You see that from less than 5,000 books sold in 1 year from Italy to other countries, we arrived to the 8,600 books sold in 2019, which is a very important achievement from our side. Italy is the fourth publishing industry in the world, in Europe, sorry, after Germany, France, and the UK. it is larger than the Spanish. That's an important position in the European rank. What happened during this unfortunate year? You see those two graphs that are interesting because of the big difference between the two. That is, the data are referred to the first 39 weeks of the year. So that means from the 1st of January to 27th of September. And you see that the number of books that have been issued by the Italian publishers really fall down during the breakdown, the lockdown that was in Italy from beginning of March to the first week of May. After that, the printed book production came back to the situation in 2019, but was still 13% less than last year. On the opposite, the situation for the ebooks, there was really a boom, in particular in the period around in May, when because during March and April, publishers eventually reorganized the production process very quickly in order to produce much more ebooks than in the past. You see that very high peak in one. And the situation after 9 months in 2020 is that the Italian publishers issued 13% more books this year than last year. This is the level of sales. The situation was very bad in April, till April. When in May we opened the doors, we exited the lockdown, situation improved, but still at the end of September, the loss is 7% in comparison from the entire period from 1st of January to end of September, is 7% less than last year. This is quite an important loss, but we were optimistic before the last weeks of the second wave of the COVID, because you see that we were in a situation of having minus 20% at the end of April, that became minus 11% mid-July, and then 7% in September. We were optimistic in reaching almost close to the situation of the year before at the end of the year. Unfortunately, the second wave of the COVID again created a lockdown in several areas in Italy, so we don't know what will happen at the end. And in particular, Christmas is the period of the year that counts for two, the December month, because of the Christmas presents. And so we don't know if the Christmas campaign will not go well. The risk of a very significant loss is still there. Important data are related to the market share of the online stores. You saw that in 19 they had 27% market share. That in April, for the entire period between 1st of January to 18th of April, became 52, but in some weeks in March and April was close to 70%. So more than 2/3 of the books were sold online because the bookshops were almost all closed. And then the bookshop, after the reopening, started a slow recoup of the distance. It was at the end of September, they had the market share of 57% was in the bookshops or in the physical channels in general, and 43% in the online. Again, it's hard to make forecasts for the end of the year because of the new lockdowns that are. It's not in Italy. It's not a general lockdown, but there are lockdowns in several areas, including some important areas like Lombardia, where that is the most populated area. But it's very interesting, this slide that show you the kind of data that you are able to have, very precise, very timely provided. These are data of all the weeks, of all the first 39 weeks of this year, and then are interesting because we decided to present the data without including the Amazon, that is the Amazon sales, that is now very largely the best, the leader in selling books in the country. You see that we had a loss till 70% during March. Then when we moved after the opening, which is around the week 20, after the opening, the situation improved more and more, and we had the positive figures already in the weeks from July to September, even excluding Amazon. With the Amazon data, the data are even better. But what this is the graph that we also provide to the government and we were at that moment at the beginning of May, when we were discussing the measures to support the publishers. And if you see the same graph, just not looking to the at the moment when we were discussing, we went to the government with those data that were just at the week ending at the end of April, sorry. And we went to the government discussing the situation and told them, okay, that's the problem we have, that the data, including Amazon, are better than that. But we are still in a big crisis. We are losing more than 20% of the market at the time. And the channel that is more suffering are the independent, the bookstores, the physical bookstores, so both independent and the chain. So we have to prepare some measures to support the sector, focusing on particular on this area. So not just having something that is good for all, but tailoring the measures in order to spend better the money, to be more effective in spending the money to the bookshops. You don't need to support the e-commerce at this stage because the e-commerce is going well alone. So what happened afterward was that recoup. The government announced the measures, and the measure worked very well. And one of the reasons why we are back in a good situation was because we were able to design the measure without spending too much money. There was significant money, but less money was spent than if you had to just create a measure that was for everybody, because tailoring the measure allowed it to use better the public sector money and allowed, in our case, the sector to recoup very quickly compared to also other countries, other situations. Okay, that's a demo of the importance of having a good book data infrastructure. And sorry if I spoke first about my country rather than rather than entering directly in a more general prospect. But that was important for me in order to give you the example of the value of having book data, a book data infrastructure that can help you in finding the data that you need at a certain moment, even not planning, even suddenly deciding that you need something. And I will provide another example afterward. How is the situation in your country? I have very little idea, but I read the draft of the British Council report on the Ukrainian publishing, and I saw some sentences that I report here because it seems to me very significant. The report says that many publishers commented that their publishing strategy were not as well formed as they would like due to the absence of reliable market data. And the lack of statistics was seen as an impediment to understand the true picture of sales and consumer demand. And furthermore, that there is an obstacle to growing domestic and international. And there were also some interesting sentences about why there is a lack of data. And the main was that reluctance amongst publishers to share sales data because those sales data are seen as commercial advantage. And this is, you should not think that this is a characteristic of your country. It's always in this way, or at least almost everywhere. There is this similar attitude by the private entrepreneur, and it is completely reasonable. However, this is in particular from the bigger companies. So the bigger companies tend to say, okay, we have more data, and this is our advantage. Why I have to facilitate my competitors? And so I want to preserve my advantage. Reasonable on some extent. However, you have always think that we are all small against the big. I noticed that the Ukrainian publishing turnover is just 1/4 of the turnover of just one publisher in Italy, the biggest Italian publishing group, which is okay. That's okay. Ukraine against Italy, but it's also for Italy the same, because if you look at the Italian publishing turnover in total, it's just 1/3 of the turnover of the biggest global publishing group alone. So one company have a turnover that is 3 times of the Italian publisher turnover in total. Okay, that's a relative thing. But then you can see that if you take the figures from Amazon and compare with the total publishing turnover in the European Union, including UK, when I did this is 10 times higher the Amazon turnover alone, and just consider the gross profit, so the money net to the cost of Amazon is 5 times the European Union publishing turnover. So having the idea of being big enough that you don't need cooperation is a mistake, because we are all small against the big tech. So let's come back to which data are to be considered to have what I call a book data infrastructure. Data are from many categories, 4 categories, and are of different genres, of different types. First category is production. That is the number of titles, the print run, the format. So if the printed, digital, or audiobooks, and the bibliographic data for every title, that including the subject of the books, the cover reproduction, the table of content, etc. And you can consider in a broader point of view, you can consider also the full text of the book as a datum related to the product. Second is the sales. You may have the total sales at cover price or at the actual price per transaction if you don't have the fixed book price. And you may have the sales per format, per type, per journal, per subject. So you like to know how many ebooks and which is the turnover of ebooks versus the printed books and audio books, or which are the type, if it is the textbooks, scholarly publications, or trade publishing, that are different things. Or you may go more into details related to the subject, which is the market of the books of psychoanalysis. Then reading. Reading is, again, how many people read, how many books, what time they spend, where they buy the books. And then you can, and then you can compare this, you need to compare this with some other variables like demographic data, so to understand if the younger read more or less than the old people. And in relation with the other cultural consumption, which is the relation being or people reading and people watching the TV or the TV series or the YouTube or the theater, the cinema, etc., or the relation to the use of technology, which kind of use of technology does, and then which is the relation. And finally, there are data related to the copyright. So the rights ownership, what the agents, the rights type, the people that are able to provide a license for a certain thing. So you see that when we speak about data, you have a very broad picture that it is impossible that you may a situation where you have all the data we are speaking about. All the situation is always that you may have some of those data, the best data in this big framework. I will tell you about sort of ideal situation. And then I with some caveat that something is achievable, something should be achieved step by step, something will never be achievable, but is needed for a general vision of the situation. Altogether, those data can be seen as big data also for artificial intelligence applications, and I will tell you something at the very last part of my. So building data in the book sector, starting from the everything, I take this way of presenting the problem by Jonathan Noble, that was the former CEO of Nielsen Book Data. Everything starts when you register an ISBN. When you register an ISBN, then so there is the first take of the book, the individual book data is the ISBN address. Then there is the book imprint, the database, so the catalog of all the books that are published and in commerce in a certain country. Then you have the sales data, which of their books are sold, and how many, how much money they produce. And then finally the statistics, so the manipulation of those data in order to provide forecasts, to provide a better landscape if you don't have entire data. And so you have to expand it to the entire population of the market. So starting from the production data, as I said, the ISBN registration is the first act producing data about the title. There are some very basic metadata that are mandatory in the ISBN standard, but apart what is mandatory, what is not, it is the message is that the information in terms of metadata provided in this phase are key for any development afterward. So providing author, title, number of pages, cover image, abstract, whatever, to the ISBN agency or to companies that are associated with the ISBN agency to manage this data is very, very important to have then a good books in print database. The books in print database is the core of most of the following applications. Books in print contain all the rich metadata you can imagine, and but it's a different thing in comparison with the national bibliography, which is or other library catalogs, because a books in print collect data related to that are bibliographic, that are the same that the librarians collect about the author, title, pages, etc., the publisher, of course, etc., but also collect data related to price and availability. Price and availability are crucial, but from the technical viewpoint are quite different than the other data, because when you provide to a library the bibliographic metadata, those metadata do not change afterward. There may be mistakes, you may have to correct something, but if the author is well written and the title and the pages and the publisher, etc., are well presented, then you have not to change. That does not change any time more. Price may change, and above all, availability may change. A book can be in commerce, can be stocked can be distributed by a certain distributor or present in a certain wholesaler, but all those things may change. Stock maybe can be out of stock and then is in reprint, or there can be planning a new edition, or can be just out of commerce because they finished its life. So those things are subject to change, and when things that are subject to change, when some data are subject to change, requires to the manager of the database to make a completely different job, because it's completely different just to collect once the data or to check every day if any of the data you have in the database changed in the meantime. So the organization of a good books in print is a completely different job than the organization of the national bibliography. Both are very important things, but it's important also to understand that there are different jobs. Then there is another element that is very important, which is the subject category. The subject category is again different. So the classification by subject is different in the commercial world in comparison with the library world. Because the commercial classification is not limited to the subject, but in some extent combine the subject with the target audience. I say that if you have a book about astrophysics, the subject is astrophysics, but according to a commercial categories, it's completely different. This is for children, to explain how the stars and planets works to children, or if it is a textbook, or if it is a scholarly publication just to other astrophysicians, or is a popular science publication, just to explain the astrophysics to everybody. So a subject category that consider both the subject and the audience is very important for commercial purposes. There is quite recently has been created this standard that is called TEMA. The Americans call it TEMA. I am Italian, and TEMA is a Latin term, so I pronounce it a Latin way, but you usually hear TEMA in this case. And here there is the link to go and navigate the schema if you are interested in. Just a caveat, you see that for the books in print, the print run is not included. Usually, print run is not collected by the same source that provide bibliographic commercial data. Other organizations take care. There may be different in different countries. In Italy, is the National Institute of Statistics that do statistics every year about the book production, including the as you understand, and in particular to reduce the reluctance of publishers and retailers to provide data to books in print database, there is a problem. There is a problem because the books in print database is usually in a monopolistic situation. It's a natural monopoly. It does not make sense to have 2, 3 or 4 books in print databases. Everywhere there is just one. In the past, in the 70s, there were 2 companies in the UK doing this job, but then even in the UK, they resulted to one merging with the other. Because of this natural monopoly, there is a big problem of governance of this company. Because access of data must be offered to all players in the market. It cannot be limited to few. And it should be done in what is called FRAND licenses. That stands for fair, reasonable, so the price should be affordable, not discriminatory, so everybody should enjoy the same conditions. Market. In many countries, the problem of the governance is solved through involving in the ownership of the bibliographic agency directly the publishers and booksellers association. This happens in Germany, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Sometimes, like in France, also including individual large companies, for instance, in the same company. That's allow everybody to be represented in the decision making within the bibliographic agency. In other countries like Italy and the UK, the bibliographic agencies are independent companies, but collaborate with the Publisher Association and also with other stakeholders to ensure a fair market behavior. There may be different solutions to the governance problem, but the governance problem should be approached. Otherwise, it is impossible that everybody cooperate with the books in print. Which kind of decision making is supported by the books in print? I quote again the British Council report that says that several librarians interviewed said they found difficult to have comprehensive. This is the typical function of the books in print to inform everybody, the booksellers also, not just the librarians, and also the readers directly which new titles are being published, and they provided the best information about that. The bookkeeping is also essential to speed up the logistic in the book order, authorizing returns, etc. If the subject classification is well used, it's also important for analyzing market segments and also small niches, and are used often to feed other services. For instance, in Italy, we do use the bookkeeping data to feed the database of books offered for translation rights, which is managed by another organization. Then you see the website there, or to provide to interested people the information about the existence of an accessible version for blind people of a certain book. Foundation we created, the Publisher Association, together with the Blind Union in Italy, to facilitate the production of accessible books. Sales data. I'm speaking here just because of lack of time of the trade publishing data, because the other sectors have different models. But usually for the trade, data are collected via automatic digital tools, which is not easy to implement, but it's very important to have. There may be via direct connection with the bookshop's account system. So the company that do the service take the data every night from every bookshop that is linked. Or the direct connection with the bookshop cache, which is slightly different. The main difference is that in the second case, you may have also the data of the individual receipts, not just the end of the day. And you can see, for instance, how 2 books are bought together or 3 books are bought together, and this is a relation that how using this data in decision making is very, very important for publishers. They estimate the final sales in advance. They optimize the timing for reprint. If they see that from the bookshops, the books are sold and the stock is close to be finished, they it's quicker to do a reprint, and this also allows to make a small reprint every time and check if everything is sold. And this is a very big save in terms of printing cost, and in particular to the stocking cost. They may better manage the returns, optimize the logistic of distribution. If they see that in certain area there are situation of out of stock, and in others there are many books still available of the same title. And then we can also analyze data from micro territories. For instance, if you want to measure the impact of a book presentation in a city, not just for if you did in a bookshop, not just the book that bookshop sold in that moment, but then what happened in the rest of the city. You may use data for that. Also, distributors and retailers may improve their logistics thanks to data, and also receive data intelligence from the market, from the sales data. Finally, the statistics. It's very rare that the data collected through automatic system, that was the previous one, cover all the retailers. And you need to make some statistic manipulation and elaboration to understand the whole market, also for the bookshops that do not provide you data. So there are companies that like Nielsen that do very well this job. And it's very helpful. It's more helpful when the number of bookshops that provide data automatically is smaller. The more are bookshops that are connected to this network, the less is important work of further elaboration statistics. But the statistical services also allow you to better interpret the data provided by the shops. This is very important for many reasons, both for the publishers and also booksellers to decide the strategy, but also important for political decision. I can tell you a story just 3 days ago. The government, we were discussing with the government to provide a dedicated measure to support two very little niche of the market, that are the tourist guide and the art books that are sold in the museum. It's a niche for us, but in total it's close to 100 million euros. Not so small business. It's 7% of the total trade publishing in Italy, but it's important. Two important segments. Then to telling this to the government was they understood the problem, but then they asked us if to provide evidence. What we were able to do is to provide data exactly for the weeks, for the different weeks, the data that I show you for the total market, exactly for that and so we were able to demonstrate the damages suffered by those publishers, the size of the two niches, the number of publishers affected, and the tailoring of the measure. We don't know if the government will accept to do something for them, but we know that we were able, in one day, from the request from the government, because we had this very good infrastructure for data. At that point, you switch the right button and you can make a report on that market niche in one day. And this really changed the landscape, because a government, of course, does not like to waste the money. So they want to say, okay, I want to tailor very well my measure. Otherwise, it's not good for us. Finally, very shortly, I will is reading. I see that you have a nice reading survey. Of course, all the reading survey today should be replanned, in my view, because we have the way of reading is changing because of social media. People spend a lot of time in social media and have a different way of reading. That's the evidence that we have in many countries. And I think that this also requires a change in the way we do survey the reading habits. I reported to you with this, a reference that is very important. There is an excellent survey on reading habits and reading promotion worldwide. So all the initiatives that are that was made by the Norwegian Publisher Association in occasion of the International Publisher Association Congress this year, that at the end it happened, but I suggest to get a look because it's very interesting. Within the Aldous project, what we are planning to do is to take two criticalities that exist in Europe. They are very evident reading that people. One, that all surveys have different methodology. So you can compare the data from Germany to Italy or Spain or to Holland or whatever. Second is that with this change and the reading is changing, everybody should, also the survey should change. And our idea is to turn these two criticalities into an opportunity that since we have to change, let's change together at European level and then have comparable data. If you are interested to join our effort, please let us know. We are very open in having contribution by other colleagues. It's not easy to say which is the decision making related to survey when you have to promote reading, which is something that we all like to do. The more you know how people read and where are the weaknesses or the strengths, the different areas, for instance, or in the different ages, this help you in planning the reading promotion activities. Finally, copyright data. I don't go through this very much. I just mentioned it because it's the next frontier of data management. We are working a lot in our research and development team about this data. I just refer to this website to know a bit more. The Ardito project website was a project coordinated by us at European level. It's something very important for the future. I am at the conclusions, and it would be a bit provocative looking at the future. Imagine that a reader go in a bookshop and buy 3 books. If you have a good system, you may have the following data. Everything about the 2 books, the 3 books, from the cover to the full text. The day of the time of the purchase. The bookshop and its location and size. And you also create a relation between 3 books and all the other data that mentioned above. Then the reader has a fidelity card of that bookshop. So you may have also data with the name, the genre, the age, or all other data that are collected by the fidelity card system. Then the reader will post a comment on Facebook about one of those books. And if you have a good algorithm, you can connect all the posts from the same account with the information above. And so you see that anytime there is an event, so a purchase, a fidelity card, a comment, a post, you have more data and more relation. And you can go to infinite of the number of data you may collect. If you multiply the scene for million readers, you have billion data, and combining your intelligence with that provided by a good algorithm of artificial intelligence, you may design your best editorial plan. But my question is, do you like this scenario? Or on the opposite is scary? Because what is happening now is that the big tech, in particular in our sector, Amazon, is working exactly in this way. And their competitive advantage in understanding the market is incommensurable. And what we have to do, in my view, to be fascinated or scared by this machine, the big data and artificial intelligence. Since machines analyze relation between data generated by events, if many events occur in a walled garden of a few big techs, those people also have the control of everything. Our political objective, and in my view, which is also a business objective, is that relations should be broken every time they touch personal data, directly and indirectly, and cooperation between all the smalls that I mentioned before, that is from the largest publisher group in the world to the smallest publishers in Malawi, to say, is needed to compete with all these bigs. And because you remember that we are all small against the big, and we need to imagine a context where cooperation will enable all companies and citizens to access the same data at fair conditions while respecting personal data and commercial confidentiality. It's too ambitious. I think that we should have ambitious. Thank you very much. I'll leave some minutes to the question. Sorry if I was a bit longer than I planned.
That's fine. That's fine, Piero. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I hope it will be extremely useful for all all of publishers who are with us now. And I've got only one question from the publishers, and I'm going to combine it with a question from Ukrainian Book Institute, which is like similarly the same. So what are the question from the publisher is, what are the new ways, maybe data-driven decisions, yes, of engagement, the new audience? And I'd like to emphasize on knowing the data about who is reading more and who is reading less. We can see that we have people who read maybe not so much, and like 1 or 5 books per year, and those who are not reading at all. So what the audience is more promising to, should we keep the audience or should we engage the audience? What strategies Italian publishers preferred?
One question was very difficult to answer. There is not one solution, I think, on that. It depends very much on the situation. So I think we have to look at the data. We have to look at the data in a way to understand the differences. For instance, I can tell you something about Italy because it's what I know. It's up to you to interpret it from the Ukrainian point of view. In Italy, we have a very, very big differences between North and South. So when you do a reading campaign, reading promotion campaign, we should approach first the South and then the North. But the existence of data about the North, it's also important to understand which are the factors they may have. For instance, a key point in our country is that the level, not of the number of libraries, but the quality of the library activities in the two parts of the countries makes a lot of difference in then the reading habits of the population. The librarians in the North are much better skilled, and they have better libraries, more modern, more efficient with the new tools, etc. And I was suggesting to the government is not to waste money making big campaigns at TV which cost money, but try to support the libraries in the South, starting from improving the skills and the engagement of the librarians, and then to invest on the physical space and the tools and the computers and etc. of the librarians. The same is the relation that exists between the presence that you can analyze also within the same area between cities with different level of librarianship, or the booksellers. Where there are more booksellers, you see more readers, because people is also involved when they go shopping. You look the window, if the window is interesting, they can enter even when it is not a reader, can enter the bookshop if the bookshop do interesting things to engage the reader, and then it becomes a reader I think that for improving reading is first of all a matter of having the right infrastructure, reading infrastructure we call libraries, bookshops, and schools, and school libraries in particular. The largest reading promotion that we do in Italy, we call it Io leggo perché, stands for I read why. That is a campaign that invites citizens to give presents to school in form of books, so to enrich the school libraries. And then we create a contest for all the schools that receive the books to award the best campaign with the kids during the school year. And this is working very, very well. We are enthusiastic of how much is working. We, in the last 3 years, we gave 1 million books to schools. The campaign this year will start tomorrow. That's the combination. And we'll see also this year with the lockdown and see that how we will manage, but we organized way to afford also this thing. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know how hard it is to speak like to nowhere, but believe me, it's not to nowhere, and all of the information we've got is like priceless for us. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope, as for me, I have thousands of questions to you, but we have lack of time. So I hope I will have a chance to ask these questions in person, maybe in Bologna, maybe in Frankfurt, maybe in Ukraine. So thank you so much, and stay with us, dear listeners.
Thank you very much to you and for the invitation.
Thank you.
For this occasion for me. Thank you.
Hello again.
Hey.
This year, Ukrainian Book Institute conducted a few pieces of research. And one of the research we also was involved in was the research of Ukrainian publishing sector conducted by British Council in a partnership with Ukrainian Book Institute. So today we are going to introduce this research and the researcher Emma Shercliffe is going to be with us today. So let me introduce Emma. I will read all of her about her experience. So Emma Shercliffe is a publishing consultant and literary agent. Emma has worked for publishing companies in Paris, Melbourne, Abuja and London, and as a research consultant for the British Council in Nigeria and Iran. She was formerly managing director of a global digital publishing division of Macmillan Publishers. In 2020, she founded Lexfield Literary Associates, a literary agency based in the UK, with a focus on working with underrepresented writers. So, Emma, please.
So,
Can you hear us? Yes?
Yes, I can hear you. I just need to share my screen, I think. Is that right?
Yes. Let's try. Oh no, we can't see your screen now. Oh, yes, it's here. Thank you.
So, okay, great. So can you see me and the screen or just the screen?
Yeah, I can see your presentation only.
Okay, great, but not me. Okay, that's fine. So hello, everybody. I'm very sorry not to be doing this in person. It's so much easier to talk to a room of people rather than a screen. But I hope very much that you'll have some questions for me that you can share with me. And I'd like to talk, I think, for probably about 40 minutes of my hour, and then leave 20 minutes for questions. And I'd be really, really delighted to do as many questions as we can fit in, questions as possible. So I'll start with the presentation. So as Irina introduced, this is a piece of research which was commissioned by the British Council in Ukraine in conjunction with the Ukrainian Book Institute, looking specifically at the publishing sector. And the research itself took place between January and sort of really up to the end of August, September. So we've had quite a lot of data collection. So I'll talk through the project, and then, as I say, we'll have questions at the end. Sorry, I need to get to the right screen here. Irina, sorry, I can't see how to both see my screen and myself at the same time.
Oh, unfortunately, it's impossible. You can show only your presentation if it's.
Yeah, but when
fine.
I'm in the. Okay, so I'll just do it here. Okay, so is that working now?
No, let's try again. Maybe your presentation now is not visible.
Okay, let's try again.
No, still no. You just need to yeah, it's here. Thank you.
We got it now.
Yes.
Okay. Right, here we go. So the aim of the research was to analyse and assess the trade publishing sector in Ukraine. So very specifically, not academic, not scientific publishing, and not schools publishing. Looking for opportunities for internationalization, so how publishers could forge links in international markets, and also to conduct a detailed needs analysis of publishers. So to look at where really perhaps support consultancy could be provided. And then the second part of the project, which is sort of, in a sense, the tangible bit of the project, is a 3-year strategy which will recommend ways in which UK sector expertise, so that can be from organisations based in the UK, it could be publishers, could be other broader cultural organisations, could be used to enable Ukrainian publishers to build international trade links and to thrive in an international market. So I'll focus primarily on the research today, and then talk about the key findings, and then talk about some of those recommendations. So just to set out the design of the project, I was very lucky to have been able to do the research pre-lockdown, only just by a couple of weeks. So came to Ukraine in February and March earlier this year, and did a trip across Ukraine, starting in Kiev, spent some time in Kharkiv and also in Lviv. And I'll talk a little bit about how we identified the respondents for the research and how we went about collecting that data. We then did data analysis, and then under normal circumstances, I'd hoped very much to come back to Ukraine to present the findings at Book Arsenal in May, which sadly was not to be. So we stopped the project altogether for 3 months during the sort of height of lockdown. You know, we in the UK were in a similar position to you in Ukraine, where we were all at home and not going out to work and not going out to offices. And bookshops were closed as well, which was a big factor. But then I resumed the data collection in July, and actually added on another part to the project, which was that I felt that this question that I'd been asking publishers back in February, March, which was tell me about the biggest challenges facing your industry, were obviously compounded by the impact of COVID. So it wasn't as if those problems had gone away, but I was keen to sort of check where people were, how publishers had coped with the crisis, and then incorporate that second round of data collection, which took place remotely in July and August, into the final findings. And then to sort of validate those findings, I did a round of focus group discussions. Again, I was lucky to be able to do this by Zoom, with the cooperation and support from the British Council and the Ukrainian Book Institute. So we assembled a group of, we invited all the respondents who'd taken, so 60 people who'd taken part who I'd interviewed, and invited them to join in discussions that we did online, and talk through some of the draft recommendations and possible ideas for the future, which then all found their way into the final report, which will be published very shortly. So in total, the project comprised over 100 hours of face-to-face and remote interviews. So there were over 60 respondents in Ukraine, and then additional publishers and people who'd taken part in perhaps British Council initiatives, or publishers maybe that had sold rights to Ukraine, and then other industry experts, some people who'd attended, for example, Book Arsenal, or taken part in training programs. So people who had a bit of an awareness of Ukraine, but with an external perspective. By sector, of the people that I interviewed in Ukraine, the breakdown looked like this. So I'll give you the specific numbers in a moment, but the primary, it won't be a big surprise, the sort of primary group of respondents were publishers themselves. And this was a really wide group of publishers. So I was very keen not only to interview publishers at the very big publishing houses, but also publishers who were perhaps owners of their small companies, founders of their small companies, and also a mixture of sort of senior and junior staff. So I didn't want to just interview managing directors. I also wanted to talk to perhaps some junior editors or salespeople or whoever it may be. So I was quite keen to have a cross section within that big group there of publishers. And then those other sectors, governmental and advisors, were really sort of stakeholders, people who were involved in the publishing industry. So that could be festival staff, that could be people at the Ukrainian Book Institute. There's a wide variety of people there, people who had some expertise in publishing. And then this is the breakdown by sector, by number. So those percentages that you saw in that previous pie chart. And I just thought it was quite interesting to list by gender as well, male and female, Again, I tried as hard as possible, as much as possible, for a split of men and women, but was not always possible. And I think this would be reflected absolutely in the UK, where in certain sectors, certainly within printing and often within retail, we tend to see more men than women. Librarians, again, we often in the UK also see more women than men. So, you know, where I tried where possible, but obviously some of those sectors at the bottom of the table there were, you know, there's a small number of people actually in real terms that were interviewed, which also skews the figures quite a lot. But they were just to show you a little bit more of the breakdown. So I sort of thought I'd put this slide right up at the beginning about the top 3 challenges facing the sector. So there was a really wide range of issues which were cited by respondents as threats to the industry or challenges that they themselves and their own companies faced. And in collating the results, I asked everybody to give me 3. So they're very widespread. I think had I asked everybody for just 1, the figures might look a little bit different. But I was quite keen to get a spread of responses and identify a range of different challenges. But unequivocally, the problem of retail infrastructure and distribution tied up also with problems of payment. So this is publishers not paying retailers on time, problems of having consignment for a long time in the stores, which those cash flow difficulties become hugely problematic for publishers. So that was, you know, by quite some way, both anecdotally, but then within the actual interviews, when I went through and did the data analysis, the number of times that came up was quite high. Also, just a lack in the demand for books, or the lack of the sort of interest in reading. The number of people that were reading, there was lots of people told me, again, this is a global trend, but you know, lots of people are now more interested in watching Netflix or playing games than reading books. And we'll see later on, I'm really interested in the ways already that some institutions and organisations and festivals have been trying to promote reading. And I think there's a lot of optimism and ways in which that sort of issue can be addressed. But it was certainly one of the biggest concerns, I think, for many people that I interviewed. Lack of consumer purchasing power. So, for example, at book fairs, lots of the respondents said that people were buying less, but more broadly than that, it was felt that people just didn't spend so much money on books at the moment. And then lack of statistics was a really interesting one. Almost everybody, even if it wasn't one of the top 3, almost everybody identified lack of statistics as a challenge for the sector, but almost nobody had a solution to this. So one of the problems, which was very, very clear to me, was that publishers don't want to share their data. There's, you know, I understand there's issues of perhaps trust and confidentiality. People are nervous about sharing their sales data, for example. And also in some ways that sales data can be seen as a competitive advantage. So if I'm a publisher that also has a chain of books and I happen to have access to sales data because I have a retail part of my business, that is in some ways a competitive advantage. So I understand why that's difficult. And then again, a very clear problem was the lack of trust in the central collation of data. So statistics, official government statistics were across the board just deemed to just not be reliable. And this was really quite a fundamental problem for publishers, in that they felt that they were publishing blind. So whereas we might, in a market where there are much more reliable statistics about demand and readership and what's selling and what's not selling, well, a publisher might use those statistics to plan their publishing program. And there really was an almost total lack of data or reliable data in those fields. However, there was absolute recognition that the work that the Ukrainian Book Institute have been doing, their work on Chitomo, the work that they've been doing to collate and research information on reading, for example, and on the types of books being sold was a good start in the right direction. But again, it's, you know, that's not a sort of fundamental across the board census of books. I won't go through the list totally comprehensively here, but unsurprisingly, piracy copyright was deemed to be a big problem. And then when we get into looking at the sort of prospects for selling rights or selling Ukrainian authors abroad, one of the problems again identified quite strongly was that even where we have publishers who are already selling rights, there's a lack of translators. So this works both ways, both translators from other languages into Ukrainian and also from Ukrainian into other languages. So we can do all the initiatives and all the programs we would like to sort of promote Ukrainian writing, but if there's suddenly a big rush of people that want to, foreign publishers that want to buy Ukrainian books, and there's not enough translators, or specifically not enough good quality translators, there's a real sort of a real sort of sticking point in the pipeline there. So again, that's something that will come out in the recommendations as an area to focus on. So I've been through some of these already, and these key findings and challenges were also all themes that were discussed at the focus groups to see if there were possible recommendations that might come out of having identified these issues. I mean, I think what's interesting about these challenges is almost none of them were of great surprise to anybody, but having sort of firm, well-researched data on which one can plan future initiatives, I think is really very important. The one other issue that came up quite a lot also was partly from librarians, but also from bookshops, about the lack of information about what is being published. So there is no central books in print. There's no database where where the consumers or librarians can go to find out what is being published. So of course, individual publishers publish their catalogues and they have information on their website, but it was generally felt that that was a bit of a difficulty in trying to raise the profile of books if the information about what's being published wasn't being clearly communicated, which goes hand in hand with this issue around poor review coverage. So not enough high quality criticism, not enough reviews of books being published, lack of cultural coverage in arts pages of newspapers, things that perhaps we might see more in more recent years, blogs and podcasts, author interviews. There was of course lots of activity around these things at the book fairs, particularly the two or three very big book fairs, but generally it was still seen as an area of weakness. And then I'll just go on to the next challenges. As we've mentioned, the lack of reliable market data. Bureaucratic government structures, this was seen as problematic in a couple of ways. So whilst there was definitely acknowledgement that the government has tried very hard in recent years to support the publishing sector, not least by the establishment of the Ukrainian Book Institute, the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, the Ukrainian Institute, and a focus on these areas. Some of the programs, the best example I think being the translation program at the Translate Now program, which was launched and administered by the Ukrainian Book Institute around the time of Book Arsenal, which was a really fantastic program, had a lot of interest, a lot of was sort of doing all the right things. But the timeline on that program was very, very short. So it made it almost impossible for a publisher who didn't already have a contact with a Ukrainian publisher, so a foreign publisher that didn't already have a contact with a Ukrainian publisher and didn't have a project more or less ready to go. The timelines which were needing to basically translate and publish and release a book by the end of that calendar year, it was just in no way a possibility for a new publisher in the UK. So if I as a publisher in the UK had read about this scheme, I would have got quite excited around April time thinking, oh, this looks fantastic. Then if I looked at the rubric, in the UK, we were already announcing in May titles for the following January. you know, so even to publish a book within that timescale would be difficult, let alone a book that needed to be translated. And the reason was because the budget had to be spent by the end of the calendar year. And there were a number of examples of this type of problem, where it's the structure in which the initiatives are taking place operate almost independently of the reality of the market. So I know these are incredibly difficult issues to tackle, but I think the whole point of having somebody external to observe these things is to state it quite clearly. And that for me was one of the biggest problems to future development, if things stay as they are. And then training and professional development, I'll talk about a little bit more. And then also something else that was identified quite a lot actually was about thought leadership, about perhaps needing to have leaders within the sector that could perhaps look forwards rather than backwards, sort of look more broadly into other initiatives taking place internationally. And perhaps sort of lead engagement amongst publishers within Ukraine. So again, the skills gaps. So one of the very specific questions that I asked respondents as I was interviewing them was where they felt they could benefit from training or from mentoring or workshops. And I was really sort of struck by how open people were in their demands for help and advice and guidance. So even publishers which I felt were doing incredibly well, and as well as any publisher in the UK, were still really keen to benefit from mentoring or from making more international connections, and we're very open to this sort of dialogue. So that was really interesting for me and very pleasing, particularly given that I felt that individual publishers within Ukraine were not as collaborative as they might be. And so it seemed that it was almost easier for people to reach outside Ukraine to make it and to learn from international experience, perhaps, than from their own experience internally. The issue with that, of course, is that another Ukrainian publisher has very, very specific Ukrainian expertise and experience, which is probably of more relevance to a Ukrainian publisher than a publisher in the UK. So, you know, I think whilst international intervention is great, it doesn't mean there's not a need for more knowledge sharing between Ukrainian publishers. However, some of the sort of more market leading publishers were also really keen to say, look, we feel that we've done all we can internally. We're leading by example, but we need to learn more. So that again strikes me as a very good reason to forge international partnerships and perhaps international mentoring relationships. So just to sort of have a quick look at this table, the really biggest gap, which was identified by a quarter of publishers, was for them, their biggest skills gaps was knowing how to sell Ukrainian books in other markets. So how do you sell a book by a Ukrainian author to a publisher in the UK or in Germany or in the United States? How do you go about making those international connections? How do you get your material into a format that makes yourself attractive to a foreign publisher? And again, there was a lot of recognition about the really very good work that the Ukrainian Book Institute have been doing at international book fairs such as Bologna and Frankfurt and London book fairs, to have stands there, to make presentations, to try to engage with international audiences, and indeed subsidies and grants to help any publishers, but particularly smaller publishers, to go to those fairs. So whilst there was quite a degree of support already being given and a good basis on which to build, this was definitely seen as an area where more can be done. There was also a lack of sort of perhaps awareness of some of the publishing processes. So many publishers have just developed their own strategies, their own editorial management systems. But again, I think this sort of very clear call for learning from how it's done elsewhere, or having examples of how it's done elsewhere. And of course, the great thing about having examples from elsewhere is that you can take those examples and then just mold them to your own needs. So it's not as if you need to take some UK publishers' strategy and publishing processes exactly, but perhaps more awareness of how things are done will make it easier to or you know, as of use if you're bearing in mind that you might then want to change it. Marketing expertise, and then sort of, you know, more generally training in editorial and contracts were sort of some of the other biggest gaps. However, there were lots and lots of really positive things that both that I found, but then other people also identified. I was really super impressed by the printing capabilities. I visited a large publisher in, a large printer in Kharkiv, and some of the technology there was absolutely as good as the publishing that we see here in the UK, as was the quality of production across the board. I mean, obviously you're always going to get books which are not the best designed and produced, but you know, in general, in a bookshop or in a publisher's office, I was really impressed with the very high quality of standards of production. And design. I mean, I think we've seen the interest in book design and illustration, like the annual competition that's run at Book Arsenal. There's a real interest and a real increasing sort of expertise in that field, which is absolutely as good as you'd find in any other market. So I think there's possibilities there for sort of showcasing that even more. As you will all know, the very lovely illustrations and high quality of illustrations, particularly in children's books, are you know, equally would rival anything produced anywhere else. And then the fact that so many publishing houses already acquire rights, so there can't be many publishers in Ukraine that exclusively publish their own works. I mean, you know, you look at everyone's list and lots of people have bought fiction or children's books or non-fiction business books from other markets. So, you know, people do know how the process works. They're aware of this rights process. It's just that at the moment, so much of it is one way into Ukraine as opposed to the other way around. But you do have some expertise, of course, in selling rights. Some publishers have been doing this very successfully for some time now. And again, whether there's perhaps more that can be learned and shared within Ukraine itself is perhaps something for discussion. And then there were some really, really cool examples of technical development that I was really excited to see. Lots of 3D, sort of 3D graphics or technical innovation, augmented reality innovation, really, really exciting and exciting for readers, and perhaps readers, when we're talking about readers being more interested in gaming or Netflix or screens, you know, having perhaps that extra dimension to a book may be a way of luring reading public back to the book. And then the book fairs, as we know, there's a lot of great work being done at Book Arsenal, at Book Forum. You've got many other fairs in Odessa and elsewhere, which really are gaining international profile. So again, a good base to draw on. And then just generally more, the fact that there's already an infrastructure in place means that recommendations, I feel, have quite a good chance of actually becoming or being implemented. I think often one can do a research project, make recommendations, and then you sort of not entirely confident that they will ever see the light of day. Whereas here, I really felt from both the respondents I spoke to, but also the institutions I was engaging with, that there was a real demand to facilitate development and to create these international links and partnerships. So I really hope that does come to be. And the fact that there was such good feedback, I think, on previous development initiatives. So programs that the British Council have run, for example, like the sort of Booking the Future summer schools that have been done, just as one example, I think it stands the sector in good stead. So specifically looking at how the British Council could help support the sector. So this was quite a specific question that I asked respondents. I mean, again, quite a wide range of possibilities, but all really with international links in mind. So already the British Council have in the past done professional development seminars. I think there was some comment that perhaps it would be helpful if some of the experts were either more briefed on Ukraine or had some working knowledge of Ukraine, because as I was saying earlier, it's fine to have an example of how things work in other markets, but you can't always take those wholesale and implement them in your own market. And as we know, Ukraine has some quite specific challenges that mean that it may be more difficult to implement some things than others. I'm thinking specifically actually of ebooks and audio, which are such a huge part of other markets, that base, but is just not the case in Ukraine at the moment. And with piracy and copyright infringement as it is at the moment, looks unlikely to develop massively rapidly. So that's a sector where perhaps learnings from the UK or the US may not be quite as relevant as in some other markets. And then just going back to sort of how the British Council could help more generally, I think, another thing which is sort of just once you've got the connections in your networks, publishers, I think, are very well equipped to develop them and stand on their own 2 feet, but just making those connections in the first place and just knowing who to approach with projects, I think is a big problem for publishers in any market trying to sell rights or to make links. So that was again felt something that perhaps the British Council could help with, as well as mentoring programs and perhaps some development around the thought leadership issues that I mentioned earlier. So in the recommendations, and I'm working at the moment on building up a sort of really quite detailed 3-year program for possibility for recommendations, like a strategy of how to implement some of these findings and suggestions. And I've broken those down into these 4 areas. I mean, I think I should say that on the recommendations, there were so many other areas where one could have focused. So clearly the chronic underfunding of the library sector, the lack of reliable statistics, the difficulties with the distribution and the retail networks, and the endemic problem of piracy. I mean, these are all really, really major issues, but this was part of the reason for the focus group discussions was to talk about this. And so after discussion with colleagues at the British Council and UBI, the Ukrainian Book Institute, and the interview respondents, it was really felt that those sort of issues, the sort of underfunding and the piracy and the lack of statistics were really areas that the Ukrainian publishing sector needs to sort out sort of for themselves. Of course we can offer as international published advice, but it's really copyright enforcement is not an issue for people outside of a market to get overly involved with, except for providing expertise or advice. So the areas that I focused on here were really areas where I think we're building on infrastructures that already exist, and also areas where the British Council specifically have expertise and can focus. So just to go through these each briefly. So obviously a huge area of potential is promoting Ukrainian writers abroad. So there are just so many fabulous writers in Ukraine, and even I now, as somebody who is obsessed now with Ukrainian literature and have read a lot of books by Ukrainian authors in the last 6 months, I just really hadn't come across many of them before. So few Ukrainian writers are published. And yet there is real interest, I think, in Ukraine. There's a huge interest at the moment in translated literature. So you have publishers in the UK and the US who are looking specifically for translated literature. You have literary hubs. You have translation agents. You have the infrastructure there and the interest. So I think the timing feels really great to be sort of ramping this up and seeing how we can shed more of a light on the work that's there, and developing literary partnerships. So that could be with other festivals, that could be with international organisations, as well as doing those sort of skills development around selling rights and perhaps also working with agents. On the training and the skills, so this is really an area in order to try and see how expertise within Ukraine that already exists can be shared more amongst Ukrainian publishers, as well as focusing in those very specific areas where the expertise doesn't exist, and looking there to try and facilitate international cooperation. So I think what doesn't make sense is to bring in a whole load of sort of editors to give really specific advice on how to edit, because that expertise exists within Ukraine. It's not being tapped and accessed. So one of the initiatives I'm suggesting in the recommendations is to develop some sort of skills hub or publishing center within Ukraine where publishers can go to find these expertise. I think one of the problems at the moment is people don't know, unless you're within a large company where you can have advice from peers or from senior managers, it's difficult for people to know where to go. So when new publishers set up, how do they find out about how to do things? How to, you know, people, and there's no sort of central repository of skills or of training information. And this doesn't have to necessarily be a really costly thing. You don't have to have a physical training center, but you can have something that works virtually. You can have virtual seminars, as we are at the moment. So I think there's one of the sort of benefits, if we can call it that, of the pandemic, is it's really made us think about ways in which training can be delivered separately. So for a small publisher, rather than having to come to a seminar in Kiev, could something be held remotely via Zoom, so publishers from outside the capital could take place in that way. And then this sort of touches on the next area of leadership development, where again the British Council have a lot of links and experts and expertise in areas of creative arts generally, thought leadership as well. So perhaps trying to find some speakers or some mentors, people who may work not just perhaps in the publishing industry overseas, but in the creative arts more generally, working out some sort of workshops or perhaps mentoring programs where that just a different way of thinking can perhaps be helpful. And then the last part of that is readership development, which it was just so clear that was an area that it's all very well having publishers and building up skills for publishers, but if there's no, or if the demand for reading itself is decreasing, then ultimately the market is going to shrink. So readership development felt to me, again, it could have been one of those things that was felt, okay, that's something that should be handled by the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian institutions, but I think it's so integral to the publishing industry, and there's a lot of expertise also in the UK on reading programs. We have something called World Book Night, which is once a year, that there's a list of books are recommended, and publishers get involved and promote certain books to really sort of stimulate reading, and which generates lots of interest, and sort of different projects like that, which could perhaps be looked at as possible examples. And then again, development in the area I mentioned earlier about this sort of lack of literary criticism, lack of reviews, lack of podcasts or just perhaps platforms on which people can talk more about the books that are being published. So how does one keep those very firm foundations of platforms at literary festivals or book fairs? How do you keep those going in a more cyclical way? How does one know every month what's coming up and what's being published? Just coming up on my 20 minutes now. So the next steps in all of this is the 3-year strategy, which will have the detailed recommendations, which I'm discussing next week with the British Council and the Ukrainian Book Institute, that we hope will then feed into a real and funded strategy. And then the publication of the full report and the recommendations, and that will be translated into Ukrainian as well. So I'm very conscious doing this in English is fine, but it's obviously very important to have this fully available in Ukrainian as well, so it's as hopefully as effective as possible.
Thank you, Emma.
Oh my gosh, I finished
I,
exactly
I hope
fast.
I hope that that our publishers could use all of the insights you've got. And actually, I I I was wondering about few findings of your research. First of all, you've mentioned, if I may ask you a few questions, I want to understand. First of all, you mentioned that the gaps in the knowledge of publishers, mostly based on the topic of rights management or selling rights abroad, but on the other side, I think maybe that's because publishers now, during the COVID, they are not so much interested in this topic, and they are just fighting for survival and trying to understand how to keep their audiences, how to sell more, and what actually do, how to reduce maybe their spendings. So don't you think that this lack of knowledge is because it's kind of second priority now?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I think one of the reasons I was keen to do that second round of data collection was for exactly the reasons that you're saying, is that what happens to all these challenges at a point at when things become very, very difficult for publishers in the market. So yes, I think that is a challenge. But I also think there's a real lack of awareness about the possible revenue streams that can be generated from rights sales. So, I mean, for the last few years, I've been running a small publisher, a really small publisher, co-founded by a business partner, and we were selling African writing in the UK, African writers, and often our cash flow, you know, we were kept going by rights sales. So, you know, you sort of have your normal sales, your sales into the bookshops, but then those sort of bonuses of a rights deal that you do to France or to Germany or to Spain or to Italy, it's a really nice additional bump, and it's, you know, that it's sort of straight profit really. So there is such potential that I think that at a time when publishers are really struggling, I know it's really difficult to sort of step back and try and see the bigger picture, but I think in some ways it's a really good opportunity to focus a little bit on that and seeing, look, where else can we get the revenue from? Because for many publishers here, right, you know, rights revenue can be a really can become really quite a sort of integral part of the business.
But you know, I think that maybe the revenue from selling rights can't be so much visible until you are not a random penguin random house, for instance. Yes, and probably people can't see these prospects of this kind of activity, and maybe you can give some comment on it. And also just one thought: when I was talking to one of the publishers, one of the big publishing houses, I asked them, okay, you can't, publishers mostly can't see this beneficial side of selling rights, of investing so much efforts, so much money in it, and you're trying to do that. So why do you think that it will be beneficial for you? And the owner of this publishing house told me the following thing: it's not interesting for us in case of money, but it's interesting for us because of our authors. If we want to be active internationally, our authors will go to another publishers. So it's mostly maybe because of like status thing, of keeping your authors with you, of keeping your team with you, and being just more competitive and like this.
That is such an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in that way. I mean, I think I think I'd thought about it in a slightly different way, that if you are going to ask an author for rights, so, you know, there's different ways of constructing publishing contracts, but generally a publisher would ask for world rights, including translation rights, including movie rights. If you are buying those rights from an author, you are morally bound to try to sell them, to try to exploit them, because otherwise what's the point of an author giving you those rights? They might as well just keep them. And I mean, but that's problematic also, because it's not as if an individual author necessarily has the means to exploit them themselves. But I think you know, I can absolutely see why it's an attractive thing that perhaps would set a publisher apart from others if they're able to exploit those foreign rights. But just back to the thing, I mean, I'm really interested you say that about the rights is sort of seen by something that is done by bigger publishers. Because you know, it's back to the example that I gave earlier, the publisher that I was I mean, I've worked for very big publishing companies, but I also, the last 5 years, was working for this very small publishing company. I mean, there were only 3 of us in the UK office, 3 or 4 of us sometimes. And yet we were able to do it. We just saw it as something that was a possible extra stream of income. And I think, given that there is this thirst for translated fiction, particularly in overseas markets, in international markets, I think it's definitely something that publishers should consider. I mean, I think it may just be that people perhaps think it's just really expensive, because in their minds they are equating it with needing to travel to international book fairs, needing to go and do stuff in person. But I think that's I mean, that's where it's obviously good for me to get feedback as well, but I think that's somewhere where perhaps in the recommendations we can focus, like, how do we sell rights? How do we help publishers to sell rights without them having to put masses of budget into the process to start with?
Yeah, it's the idea, I think, of whole of this process, and probably this situation with COVID-19 will also give us some opportunities, because I can see and I can feel this atmosphere that from one hand, on the one hand, we can see that borders kind of have been risen during this quarantine, and we created actually these borders, but the other people, the other publishers, they felt it like an opportunity, and we can see that so many people are actually interested in our literature, in our market, and they started to listen to us. It was impossible before to gather an audience, let's say 100 people, yes, and even in Ukrainian national stand, I mean international audience, not those who are Ukrainians, the diaspora or something like that. But now it's really possible to speak to people who are abroad, and you can speak to hundreds of people and have maybe better effect than you can have offline. And Emma, you had mentioned that about the Translate Ukraine program, and in your research you have even more programs which support translations from Ukrainian, and it's really very useful, and I'm glad that you mentioned this, because we've got recently the new data from Book Chamber of Ukraine, and they sent us a few numbers, and we can see that the number of translations from English to Ukrainian is more than 2,000 of titles per year. And if we will compare it to some other languages, for instance German or French, it's near 100, 150, 120, something like that. And actually, but from Ukrainian language to English, we have just a few translations per year. It's just pity, but now I've got the response from our previous speaker about a piece of research I sent to him just to let him know about few details about Ukrainian market, just in draft. And he introduced me so much opportunities to include these programs into Aldus network, Aldus newsletters, and so on. So actually your report works so well. Thank you so much, and I just want to announce that we have Translate Ukraine program. We have also the program of House of Europe that supports translations, and the program of Creative Europe. So actually we have nice base to start promote these kind of things. So, and I've got one question from the publishers, if I may. I'm sorry to
Please.
take too much of time, but the publishers are interested in what kind. Do you have any ideas of the distribution models? Any findings on new distribution models publishers showed during this period of the research? Because people are quite interested in understanding the different models and this flexibility during the COVID times.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this has been really interesting. You know, how does one work during lockdown when people can't travel? So one initiative in the UK that has come up very recently, which has been in the US for a while, is a new platform called Bookshop.org, which is a sort of rival to Amazon in the UK and the US, but it's designed specifically to support independent bookshops. So one of the problems, which I didn't really refer to this specifically, but is of course an issue for discussion in Ukraine, is that online bookselling is great, but it ultimately does not help to support the infrastructure of physical bookshops. So whilst it's very convenient for us all to order online, and you know, we all do this in different ways, it's also really important that we also buy from physical bookshops. Otherwise they will just close. And then one of the problems, which was identified time and time again in the research, was that in smaller towns outside the main urban areas, it's really difficult for people to access books. And if they don't have access to the internet, then these, you know, the shops ultimately fail, and people just can't get the books. So Bookshop.org is a platform which individual independent bookshops can sign up to. So you don't have to have a very flashy website as a publisher, as an independent bookshop, but you can sign up to Bookshop.org, and it's really especially for for booksellers that don't have their own ways of selling via the internet. So a bookshop, perhaps a small bookshop that only has 1 or 2 members of staff, that doesn't have much time to dedicate it, they can have a place on this platform, and then a consumer can buy from the platform in the same way as I could buy from Amazon. But by doing it, my order is the profit from it goes to support the independent bookselling sector as well. So I mean, there's a lot of sort of different steps in it, and I'm hugely simplifying it. But it was only rolled out here 2 or 3 weeks ago in the UK, and it's had just unanimous support from both publishers and booksellers and authors and agents. And it's so rare that you get an initiative that has unanimous support, because whilst Amazon is great, it definitely undermines so much of the retail infrastructure. So that's a possibility. I've already been in touch with one publisher in Ukraine who was keen to find out about this as a possible model. So I look forward to perhaps finding out a little bit more and sharing that with the Ukrainian sector.
Thank you, Emma. And also, it's interesting. You mentioned in your research about the problem of junior staff that publishers are actually losing now, and it's I can feel this problem too, because people migrating from the sphere or just got disappointed and so on. Do you think that some kind of professional programs could help? Because now of course, if we are trying to build the community, which you have mentioned that is quite not so strong, yes, it's easier to do without pandemic circumstances, of course, and it's really hard to do that with online. Do you think that we should influence this program with during this period, of course, how we can deal with it, and maybe you have any recommendations on this point?
Yeah, I think that issue of junior staff is a really big issue. It's a similar issue in the UK, that publishing is generally not very well paid at the lower levels. It's very competitive to get into, which means that you know, as a publisher, publishers traditionally haven't had to pay very much money because, you know, people are happy to just be in the industry, and I feel there's sort of an element of exploitation there perhaps. So but also, you know, the reality is that publishers don't always make very much money, particularly small and independent publishers, of which are the majority of that sort of profile in Ukraine. And so actually there's, you know, there's also a real issue there in that there's just not enough money in the business to pay people more. But once, you know, often once people have just survived those initial perhaps 2-3 years in the industry and have got up to the next level, I think life does become generally a little bit more comfortable. So I think anything that one can do to just support junior members of staff through those early years is really important. And it may just be that sometimes it doesn't have to be only or exclusively sort of financial, but being seen to be mentored, being, you know, perhaps thinking of those 2 or 3 initial years as a training period, you know, being sent on training courses, which again, you know, if there's some sort of virtual or Zoom courses, don't have to be overly expensive, but can all contribute to professional development. And then even just having peer networks. So in the UK, there's an organisation called the Society of Young Publishers. And certainly young publishers that I've worked with have found those sorts of support networks incredibly helpful, because if you're having a bad day and you're feeling like you're just overworked and underpaid and slightly ignored, that may be the case, but in a sense, if you know that you're not the only one and that you have examples of other people that you can network with, and then in time just realize that this is just sort of almost like a rite of passage, which doesn't make it okay, but makes you feel like you just get through it. And then hopefully once you then yourself are in a position of management, you can change things by perhaps operating a little bit differently and encouraging the younger and more junior staff in a different way. But yeah, it's a real problem, because I think if you lose staff in those early years, it's you lose that sort of freshness of thinking.
Emma, but don't you think, I heard that this kind of problem is really similar to many countries, and even rich countries which quite developed publishing sector also sometimes have, like, people from the publishing has not even not the average salary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem broadly across the creative industries, I think. I think you hear similar stories in TV and in film, and, you know, these sort of, you know, quite attractive to some arts graduates sort of industries. You know, everybody wants to be in film, they want to be a runner, they'll do, you know, loads of unpaid work experience, they do lots of internships. I think, yeah, you're right, it's not a problem specific to Ukraine at all. It's definitely something that one sees across the board. You know, but I don't think it's okay to sort of say, oh, because it's just the way it is, and because it's the way it is in other markets, there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, I think there really are some sort of quite basic things that one can do. So in the UK, for example, there's a sort of minimum pay. The the Association of Publishers has sort of minimum recommendations. There's government guidance also on things like unpaid work experience. So I know, for example, the Association of Authors Agents here in the UK have recently put out a document which really encourages and reminds other agents of how they should be employing young graduates and what they can be doing for them in the early years.
Okay, Emma, I'm just lost the connection with you for a moment. Okay, I think it's renovated. So if you can hear me, I have the very last question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, super. So the very last question is about the directions of research. It's not my question, I swear, but I'm really interested in it. So you have mentioned that you have some findings on this research, but maybe one of the findings of your research is about what research should be conducted. I mean, where we need to get really deep after understanding what the general situation is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can definitely see where the gaps are. I mean, you know, as I said, it was felt that that was not going to be necessarily an area for the British Council specifically to focus their recommendations are. But certainly, I think we have a lot of data now from the report and the findings of what's lacking. And I think, you know, I think that's a really good question, because I think from the findings of the report, it's pretty easy to draw out a list of areas for, you know, areas for further research, you know, under auspices of another project, or, you know, whether it's Ukrainian Book Institute or another organization that does it. And to also encourage independent academic research in the area. So it's, you know, research might be done under not under the auspices of a government organization, that can be done independently. I think one of the things that I was really struck by was the way in which all the respondents I spoke to were just very open. I mean, obviously I was very, very careful to emphasize confidentiality within the structure of the way I did the interviews, but people were generally just incredibly open, and I hope and feel that that has contributed to really a quite rich set of data that I've been able to include in the report. So I think yes, absolutely, there's loads of scope there. I mean, specific areas, I mean, I think already, you know, you're obviously doing a lot of work already in looking at reading, but I think sales figures are just probably you know, we don't really know print. I mean, we have some idea, but the book chamber data, as we know, it's just not reliable. So some sort of independent audit of you know, publishers independently reporting sales figures, as opposed to what they say that they've sold, you know, as relates to sort of what they're being taxed on. I think there's a real gap there that could absolutely do with a rather large research project around it.
Emma, I'm really grateful for being with us now. Our time, unfortunately, is to finish. So I hope that you will come back to Ukraine, physically even, and in your maybe further research. And I know that you have now your own literary agency, so probably our authors can also somehow and publishers be in touch with you. I hope this connection won't be lost, and we can also, I will announce that the research should be available in December, so everyone can see what the result is. Thank you so much, Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Irina, so much, and thank you everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.